Hello, this is Carrie Lewis from Montana State University in Glacier County. One of the questions that some beginning agents have asked is, how do I go about submitting a forage sample? What labs do I use? How do I go about it? Who pays for it? And so today we'll try to address a few of those topics. If you have questions following this video, feel free to reach out either to myself, any of the other members on the Ranch to Ribeye video team, or our forage or beef extension specialists. We also have videos on how to go about taking that forage sample, so you can watch those and share those with your producers as well. So at this point, hopefully your producer comes back into the office and has a sample of the forage that they've taken. This is an example of what that might look like. A Ziploc bag. It should be labeled with their name on it, the year, and the type of forage. Any other information that they want to track can certainly go on that bag as well. When you have producers come in to check out the hay probe, you could also give them a copy of the Mont Guide, Collecting a Forage or Feed Sample for Analysis. That explains how to go about collecting a sample as well. And again, having a hay probe in your office is a great tool to have on hand for producers to use. So when they bring the sample back in, it's good to have a conversation, make sure that the sampling was done correctly and subsampling done correctly as well. For example, I had a producer come in with 25 different Ziploc bags, and I thought, wow, this is going to get pricey. We had a bit of a conversation. I figured out that they, instead of combining all the samples from one lot of hay into one Ziploc bag, had kept every one of their sub-samples separate. So we were able to combine those into one sample to represent that lot of hay, which saved them a fair bit of money. So just have that conversation, especially if things look a little bit off there. Make sure those bags are properly labeled, and also make sure that you have their contact information so you can communicate the results to them. So, in terms of actually submitting that sample, what lab should you use? Well, there's lots of labs out there. The National Forage Testing Association provides a list of certified laboratory facilities and also gives them a rating, A, B, C, D, etc. So you can check that list out. Within MSU Extension, we can't recommend a specific lab over another, but you can see what works for you, maybe visit with a neighboring extension agent, see what they use, and again, it's up to you in terms of maybe what your preference is as you go along. You can also check with those labs to see what their fees are, what type of analysis they provide, and also what services they have. For example, many of the labs will actually send shipping labels, bags, etc., that you can use to put those samples in, you can give out to producers, etc. So that's a nice little added benefit that some of those labs do provide. So next, what tests are actually needed? This is again a conversation to have with the producer. One of my first questions is, what will you be using this hay for? Are they planning to sell it? Do they want to sell it as dairy quality hay? Or are they just going to be feeding it to their cows, horses, or sheep, for example? We'll always receive dry matter back from the lab, and then beyond that, typical analyses that we typically want to have would include things like TDN, total digestible nutrients. This is a measure of energy and is very important for balancing rations. Also, net energy for maintenance and gain. Crude protein, really important one. And then we also typically have things like NDF, neutral detergent fiber, calcium and phosphorus, two minerals we are especially concerned with in terms of balancing cattle rations. And then relative feed value and relative feed quality, RFV and RFQ, are estimates of quality that are typically used, especially when selling hay. Now there's additional parameters that you might want to include as well, but those are some of the more common ones. A lot of labs will have various packages, and therefore the producer gets a little cheaper price if they have multiple of these parameters included versus just testing for crude protein, for example. In addition, if it's a cereal forage, we would especially encourage getting a nitrate test done. Hopefully that producer came into the office and had a quick test done before they cut that forage. However, there can be variation that can exist, and so now that this forage has been baled up, been sampled, now's the time to get a quantitative measure by doing a nitrate test. Typically, the nitrate test is very inexpensive, especially when bundled with some of these other tests. So definitely encourage the producer to get that done. Occasionally, a producer might be interested in a mold or yeast count or mycotoxins. If so, I would suggest visiting with the lab first, as they may have special sampling procedures or shipping procedures that are needed for those samples. Also, those tests can be relatively expensive sometimes, somewhere between $100, $200 or more. And so that's definitely something that you want to check with the lab first about, communicate with the producer and decide, do they really want that before they go ahead and order it. In terms of mycotoxins, the MSU Scudder Diagnostic Lab in Bozeman may be able to identify some of those mycotoxins first, so check with them before sending that sample onto the lab. Another question is, what method of analysis is best to use? The two that we want to discuss are wet chemistry and NIR. Wet chemistry is an established lab test that quantifies protein, fiber, fat, and minerals. It's pretty much the gold standard, but it does take a little bit longer and costs a little bit more. Now, NIR also exists. NIR stands for Near Infrared Spectroscopy, and that's a technology that uses light reflectance to quickly and accurately measure nutrient content. The NIR instrument is calibrated to the standard, which is wet chemistry. It's quick and it's less expensive, but it's best used on our more typical forages, say alfalfa, grass hay, etc. If you have something kind of unique, maybe that's a cereal grain, maybe that's Willow Creek hay, for example, they probably don't receive nearly as many samples of those, so the calibration's probably not as good, so wet chemistry is likely the better way to go about that. But again, if a producer has lots of hay to sample, it's just for their own use, NIR can be a good way to get those results quickly and relatively inexpensively. Now, how do we go about actually submitting the sample? There's going to be a form to fill out. This would be an example of one of the forms that I typically use. Some labs also have forms online or as a PDF that you can fill out. And so a couple ways that you can go about this. You can help that producer fill out the form and then have them ship everything to the lab themselves. So that being the hay sample, the form, a check, whatever's needed, you can list yourself on the form as, send results to yourself as well with your email address. And then that way the producer is in charge of getting that sample to the post office and they take care of all the payments from there. Some offices do handle the shipping for the producer and then invoice the producer once the lab bills them and then add on the shipping costs as well. So if you have an external account and you have an admin who doesn't mind doing a little bit of paperwork, that can be a nice service to provide to your producer in terms of boxing up the sample and making sure that that billing gets done as well. One other thing to note is typically labs will keep the sample on file for a little while. So if you do send the sample in, the producer gets it back and then decides, I think I would like to go ahead and have that nitrate test done. Go ahead, call the lab, see if that sample is still available. They can likely add that test and get it done quickly versus you telling the producer that they have to go back out and get a new sample through probing more bales of hay. Typically, results can be available anywhere from 7 to 10 days. Again, that'll depend on the type of analysis, when it's shipped as well, but within 1 to 2 weeks, you should have results back. If things seem like they're not moving very quickly, don't be afraid to call that lab and just check and make sure that they did receive the sample. Once results are received, and again, you want to make sure you're listed on that submission form as well, so that you do get a copy of the results, you can go ahead and help the producer interpret those. Make sure that you always interpret them on a dry matter basis. There's going to be 2 columns listed in your analyses, and dry matter is the one that we want to look at. That has taken all the moisture out of the sample and gives us analysis on a dry matter basis. That way we can compare various forages. Once you have that, you can go ahead and forward those results to your producer. You might also include a copy of the Mont Guide, Forage Analysis Interpretation, that talks about how to how to interpret those analyses, and if a nitrate test was done, you can also include that nitrate toxicity of Montana Forage's MONT Guide. One thing that I do want to point out is that MSU has more conservative nitrate recommendations than many labs. So for example, when I receive a test back, oftentimes the nitrate level will be listed and it will say safe. However, according to MSU extension recommendations, that might be marginal to actually use for bred livestock. So I do like to point that out with a note saying MSU recommendations are this, therefore go off of Montana State University recommendations, not necessarily what the lab said. So do pay attention to that. Next, you can also offer to help producers balance their rations. So now that you have their various forage sample analyses back, you can go ahead and offer to help balance those rations for protein, energy needs, stage of production, etc. We do typically use the brands program in MSU Extension for ration balancings. And if you have questions on this, check with the veteran agent or your beef specialist. But this is a great resource to help producers with and can have some pretty large impacts in determining, yes, these cows need supplemented in the second trimester, or you have some really high quality hay. Maybe you can actually sell some of this to your neighbor and you can stretch some of your hay supply a little bit longer throughout the winter. So we can have some really big impacts by helping balance these rations. If you have questions, be sure to check with the MSU forage or beef specialist, or feel free to check with myself as well. And again, we hope this was useful and we wish you all the best.